new piece of work for us. We are very clear that our focus is on the family member rather than the substance user themselves. And we believe that often family members are neglected, ignored, and their needs are not always recognised. We work as a national organisation. We've got 3 areas of work. We have some direct work with frontline work with family members themselves, including a project in one town in this country which works with kin carers who are looking after children of substance users. We work to train professionals and practitioners, and we also hold a series of forums at regular intervals across the country to help enable practitioners to share practice and learn from particular topics. And our 3rd area of work is advocacy and campaigning on behalf of families themselves. Excuse me. So we would work with parliamentarians, with government officials, with try and influence the media and the general public to raise awareness of the needs of families affected in this way and respond to those needs. So Adfam itself was set up in 1984 by the mother of a heroin user, and we're still very proud of the fact that we have a very, very strong engagement with our family members with lived experience, and they give us insight, experiences, tell us about what their issues are, so we can base a lot of our work, particularly our policy and campaigning work, around what those issues are. Okay.
Thank you, Viv. That's very helpful. We're going to now go through the webinar, and we're going to be asking Viv a series of questions. Now, those questions were submitted in the main by our ISSUP members, so we really very much appreciate the input that those of you that have sent those have given. So thank you very much. And this interview is going to be led by the questions that have been received to ISSUP. We're going to split the questions between the 3 ISSUP staff. So myself, we've got James Harvey on, who's our Communications and Marketing Officer, and Livia Edega, who's our Deputy Director. And the 3 of us are going to go through, and we've collated questions where multiple people ask questions around the same topic. We sort of generalised and pulled those together. So the 3 of us will go through and pose the questions. If during the process of listening to the webinar today you have further questions, you can pop those in the questions box, and if there is time at the end, then we will attempt to go through those. So we just want to start off at the beginning, really, Viv. If you could tell us really why we need to be concerned about families, why this is really a specialist subject.
Well, I mean, I made the point about families being neglected, and I think in the past, often families have been seen as part of the problem. Certainly when I started working in this area and we were looking at young people's own substance misuse, we often used to think it was their parents' fault. We know that that isn't the case. Okay, there may be dysfunctional families with a lot of problems, but most family members that we come across are extremely concerned about their loved one and want to help them. I think what we often don't recognise is that families need help and support in their own right. Often we think, oh, they're a bit of a, how can I put it? They're there to help the user. We certainly know from the research that if you do have a family involvement, somebody is more likely to go into treatment, to stay in treatment, and to recover afterwards. So they've got that family support around them. But we also feel very strongly that family members can't do that without having the support for themselves. And we hear many stories, and we know from the evidence that the impact of living with, or being, not just living with, but being impacted by someone with a substance misuse problem, it can be ongoing. It's not just a snapshot. We come across family members whose loved one may have left home years ago, but they're still experiencing a whole range of impacts, from stressors, mental ill health. They may have physical problems, and if they are supporting a family member, they may be in financial difficulty because they get stolen from, to be honest, a lot of the time. I mentioned there's also the issue of unpaid carers. Many of these family members, particularly, I have to say, particularly mothers, end up as carers, not just for grandchildren because their own parents can't look after them, but for someone in their family who's got a substance use problem. So they are unpaid carers, they're helping the economy in that sense, and yet they do not get any recognition. Well, they're not getting enough recognition for themselves. So that's the kind of, those are the issues: physical, mental, social, whole range of issues that can be long lasting and can affect a family member very, very deeply for a long, long time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Viv. Thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. And thanks very much, Viv, for being here with us. I feel like you answered most of my question already. Could you just give some more examples of the family situations that you support at Adfam? I know you've mentioned a few already.
Yeah, what I thought I'd do to answer that question, Olivia, was, if it's okay, was just to read out the story, as the story from one of our supporters. Yeah. I mentioned that engagement is very, and our research is, a lot of it is, or most of it, is getting stories, testimonies from family members, so we get a picture of what their life is like. So I thought I might just read this to give you an example. So this is from somebody called Katie. So I'll read this through if that's okay. Having a loved one with a drug or alcohol issue is hard at the best of times. Many don't realise that living with addiction often comes with daily domestic violence, financial difficulties, mental abuse, stress, depression, and anxiety. My personal experience in having a family member, my brother, is dependent on Class A drugs. It's been extremely unpleasant and only heightened the many issues that we now face every single day. My brother, who's been addicted to Class A drugs for 18 years now, was apparently going through a relatively good phase. This is recently, until we came to the lockdown, and he was on a 12-step program helping him with his addiction. Since the UK has been in lockdown, his meetings have been cancelled. He's now gone on a 3-week bender, and it's catapulted my family back into a life of harassment, lies, threats, bullying behaviour, stress, anxiety, helplessness, and financial pressure to pay off debts he's incurred because of his action. In amongst all this, my parents, who significantly support my brother's life, are finding this situation very, very difficult. I've not been in contact with my brother for almost a year now, a decision I made to protect my mental health from spiralling again, but I'm seeing the impact that it's having on my parents and my younger brother. Even though they put on a brave face, I've become really good at seeing straight through it. So I think this is somebody, Katie, who's had a gun held to her, who's, as she says, suffered from domestic violence. And even though she's not in touch with her brother anymore, even though she doesn't physically have any contact with him, she's still affected by it, and so is her family. So we have many, similar stories. Some of them, we like to look at the hopeful bits of all this, when people can get help and how they can then support each other, often with peer support, and come out of that spiral. But I'm afraid that a lot of the problems, it's a constant worry, and a lot of families just wish that they could get their loved one into treatment and then he or she would be better. But unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. And even if it does, the road to recovery can be a long and stressful one, and those stresses can continue. But I hope that gives a bit of a picture of what we're facing. And, Katie is the sibling, she's the sister of a heroin user, but we have many people who are adult children of people who've misused alcohol, people whose loved ones have died because of addiction, people whose loved ones not only have an addiction problem, but they've also got a dual diagnosis. They've got mental health problems as well. So that makes it extremely doubly difficult. And as I've mentioned, I think living with someone or coping, having a loved one, if you don't mind the expression, a loved one who's got a substance use problem, it doesn't come on its own. It's not just a single issue. All too often there are other problems, as Katie mentioned, domestic abuse and mental health problems, and a lack of finance often. So it's not just the one problem, there are others.
Thank you so much for sharing Katie's story. I think it really gives us such a much better picture and a better understanding of what family members have to go through. Thank you.
Yeah, hi Viv. Thank you everybody for joining us today. Viv, I was reading a 2012 review of policy and guidance that was put together by the UK Drug Policy Commission, and one of the things that really jumped out at me from that paper was the use of the term whole family approach, because it seems that everything that Adfam does is about supporting families in their own right as part of the recovery process. So I was wondering if you could say a bit about how you approach recovery from that whole family standpoint and really what that means in practice.
It's tricky. I mean, there's a lot I could say about that. There are some family members who say, what about my recovery? This isn't just about the person with the addiction. What about my recovery? I mean, the whole family approach is a popular one. But unfortunately, I would say that certainly in England, there probably aren't enough services that offer that. It can be quite expensive because it does involve the whole family, and it's usually based on some form of counselling approach, therapeutic approach. So, for example, there is an intervention called CRAFT, Community Reinforcement and Family Training. That's based on an American model, and there's also a British model called MPACT, Moving Parents and Families Together. And what that does is very much, I think I'm right in saying, it has some resonance with strengthening families that many of our people on the call will have come across. Trying to look at the issues from a whole family approach. So it's not just focusing on the person with an addiction, it's looking at the way the family functions and how that family functioning can be strengthened to support the person and his or her use. And as I say, there are some of our family members who say, well, that's not really about me, that's about helping the person with the addiction to get better. What about me? And certainly, just as a bit of an aside, from an economic point of view, despite everything I've said, one of the arguments I have to make to people who commission or might commission family services is that if you commission a family service, you're more likely to help the person with the addiction. But it's a tricky one, and I think it's one of those areas where there aren't enough interventions. Far too often, I think our research focus in this country has been on addiction rather than on children who are affected and rather than on families affected. That probably doesn't answer all your question, James. I mean, I think it's a matter of looking at how the family functions and helping them to support each other rather than demonising the family, which is, I think I mentioned earlier, was one approach. It's quite, thank goodness, outdated now, but certainly there was a lot of, we don't want to blame families for causing the addiction. We know that it's far more complex than that.
Thank you. I suppose building on that and building on your experience of actually doing this at Adfam, how has that worked when it comes to family counselling? And how have you sort of approached sort of rebuilding those relationships between family members?
Yeah, well, certainly, psychosocial approaches, counselling approaches are extremely helpful. But I go back to my point about there aren't that many of them available. Sometimes they're available in private practice rather than in the NHS. So I think unfortunately, it's rather limited. And what happens in this country, I would say that the largest, the most widely used form of support is, okay, there is counselling but the most widely used is peer support. And that might be a local group, it might be a faith group, it might be a community group. That might be run by a counsellor or somebody who's got experience at facilitating a group. It might equally be run by somebody who's got lived experience. And because it's a relatively cheap way of delivering support, and there's also Al-Anon, which is a 12-step approach, which is again based on peer support. That is really, I would say, the most popular approach, the most widely used approach in this country, rather than counselling. Although I personally think there's a real need for one-to-one and family counselling. It's just, unfortunately, at the moment, it's quite expensive. And in this country, we've had a real disinvestment in treatment services, and that has applied to family services as well. I mean, if I tell you that when I came to Adfam in the early 2000s, I think there were about 120 groups across the country, often led by people with lived experience. They were kind of under our organisational umbrella. They were offering a whole range of different approaches: peer support, one-to-one support, buddy-in, activities, respite. And most of those services have now disappeared. And what we find is that treatment services in this country are offering family support, but often they're very stretched. They may not have got specialist training in working with families. Their expertise is working with somebody with an addiction or in recovery. And so, unfortunately, the system at the moment is not, so this is a political point, I guess, but it's not really supporting family members in the way that we would like to see. There's a lot more that could be done, but of course that depends on resources and investment.
Okay, thank you very much. I think Joanna, you had the next question.
I think is it Livia who's going to?
Yes. So I think now, Viv, looking at children of substance users, what would you say are some of the particular issues that they face as children of substance users?
Okay, I would say, again, I make the point about the impact on these children is long lasting. It doesn't come and go. It's not just a snapshot. It's not just one event. It can last all through their lives. And we know this from the adult children of someone with a drug or alcohol addiction who talk to us about, every day they're still affected by it. I think what I believe is one of the main impacts is that children, if you've got a parent who is using drugs or alcohol problematically, that substance is the key focus of their lives. That's the #1 priority. It's not going to be you as the child. It's going to be the alcohol or the heroin or whatever. And so as a child, you're going to be emotionally distanced from your parents. And yet most children will feel fiercely loyal. A lot of parents, when they're interviewed, will say, oh, no, my children don't know that I drink too much, or they don't know that I'm using whatever. But children do, and they're very, very protective of their parents. Many of them they take on inappropriate caring roles. Young children looking after younger siblings, looking after their parents. Their schoolwork often suffers, perhaps because they're not doing their homework. they're not getting supervised at homework, and yet school for them can be a really, really safe place. Homes for children like this can be very unsafe. So it's the emotional neglect, I think, trauma. People will be aware of the work on adverse childhood experiences, and certainly having a parent with a drug or alcohol problem is certainly high up on the list of an ACE, as we call them. And also, I'll go back to my point about these problems don't come as single issues. There will be other things around that. So I think the trauma, just for example, we have a project that runs in one of the cities in England, working to support usually grandparents, but they're kin carers of children, I mentioned them, whose own parents can't look after them. And when we started that project, I had no idea of the level of trauma that these children had experienced by being exposed to parental substance misuse. They were really traumatized, and we had to go back to the funder and say, please, can we, repurpose some of the money that we were going to spend on X and spend it on getting it in some specialist counselling. So it goes back, I think, to some of James's points about specialist help. There isn't much out there, but we had to do it because these children were so traumatized. So I think it's an area that we don't still know enough about. A lot of people will talk about intergenerational substance misuse, and that certainly is a problem. And we know from practitioners and frontline practitioners that exists. We know from the evidence that if you have a parent with a drug or alcohol problem, you are more likely to do that yourselves. But we still don't have any longitudinal studies that will actually track that intergenerational transfer of substance misuse problems. But children, I think children are often I don't like to use the word victim, but they are neglected in so many ways, not just emotionally, but physically. I've heard of children who would have cornflakes for every meal because there was nothing else for them to eat. They might pitch up at school not looking too well presented, if you like, and so they're going to be socially isolated as well. So it's a complex picture, and one that certainly in this country we didn't really recognise until the early part of this century. And there is a report by the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs that was published in year 2003, which is still very extant. And actually was one of the first time that this issue had been really looked at. And I think, James, you mentioned the forum, the UK Policy Forum, and the work that they've done around interventions. I think one of the things that they also found, and our work at Adfam endorses this, is the number of people who are affected in this way. Not just children, but adults. Sorry, I'm going off the point a bit, Livia, there, but that's all right. So, yeah, I think, neglect is certainly one of the real key issues. Poor parenting, and then, where do these children end up? And I think the report I mentioned, the Advisory Council report, was called Hidden Harm. And I think to this day that is still an extremely good way of describing these children. They're hidden in plain sight often. Okay.
Thank you very much, Viv. Well, my next question was on how one should approach the provision of support for children affected by parental or intergenerational substance misuse. You mentioned specialist help, counseling. Would you like to add anything to that?
No, not really, Livia, other than to say, probably I would say this, wouldn't I? But not enough of it exists. Yeah. Despite best efforts, not, and it's, of course, it's a highly specialised area, and practitioners, counsellors are quite rightly in short supply, and I mean, not quite rightly in short supply. Sorry, that's the wrong way to put it. They're highly qualified, and there aren't enough. I'm afraid there aren't enough of them. I think one of the key issues that we've got in England at the moment is the number of addiction psychiatrists who have been trained. It's just the numbers have plummeted over the last few years. So there's a real workforce shortage there. And just on workforce, I think sometimes these, you know, we've mentioned these multiple vulnerabilities that these children have, and their responsibility for them. It's not just the drug or alcohol service or the mental health service. I think it's everybody's responsibility. And if professionals can work together to help these children, I mean, for example, I think in schools, you know, universal services, social services, if we can, and ISSUP is about developing and strengthening the workforce. I think there's a real workforce need for everybody who comes across families, children and families affected by substance misuse, to have appropriate training. Doesn't always happen. Many people who are fantastic drug and alcohol workers don't find it too easy to switch over to working with children and families. People who are working with children and families, and that's their expertise, often find the whole drug and alcohol issue sometimes and understandably quite difficult to tackle and difficult to raise when they're talking to families. So there's a need for more training. There's a need to strengthen the workforce, and that workforce needs to include, I think, teachers, social workers, anybody who comes across these children and families, and whether that is to help them with interventions, whether it's to help them by giving them some of the work that we do, is to have children come together for what I call activities. So they might just go to the park, well, they could before the lockdown, might just go to the park together, or they might go bowling, or they might go out to a theme park. And what we've learned is that is really appreciated by the children, because they're all in it together, and so they can almost be peers to support they can be peers to support each other. Because if you're a child, and I know there's one of the questions in a minute about stigma, but I'll mention it now. If you're affected, if somebody in your family is a substance user, and you go along to a support group for carers, let's say, or children, or young carers, which there are some, it's quite difficult to say, I'm here because my mum or dad is a crack cocaine user, for example, or has got a drinking problem. It's much, I won't say it's not easy, but it's far less stigmatizing and non-stigmatizing to say, I'm here because my mum's got multiple sclerosis, for example. So we know that is one of the stigmatizing elements. So that's why I think putting children with similar experiences together can be extremely helpful for them.
Thank you very much, Viv. And I'll get back to the stigma question a bit later.
Okay, I know it's coming up.
So as we are all in very unusual times, there is a lot more talk and attention given to this concept of self-care at the moment. Are there particular recommendations or sort of suggestions you make for these families that are affected by substance use which relate back to their own self-care?
Well, my easy answer to that, Joanna, is to say on our website, what we've done, or my colleagues have done, is produce some top tips for helping yourselves during the lockdown if you're a family member or some family member affected in this way. A lot of the work, but on a broad, and a lot of that is about self-help, well-being, 5 ways to well-being, looking at how you can do some mindfulness. And I think we are, and Adfam, and not just us, but we're moving far more towards a more holistic approach, I suppose, to supporting families. I mentioned peer support, but what we're trying to do as well, it's becoming more widespread, I think, or popular, is actually help people with some self-care strategies. we've got some tips on our website. Okay, you can't go to a creative workshop, but there's ideas for self-development, self-expression, building on their own experiences, and people seem to like that. I mean, you know, a yoga class can be helpful, relaxation classes can be helpful, and that's alongside the information that we can give people on how to set boundaries, for example. How do you set boundaries? Sometimes that is really, really difficult, but you need to set a boundary between you and the user. How do you communicate positively? What about staying safe? We need to, I think, help families understand a lot more about addiction from the brain science angle, for example, to understand how to manage conflict and to also understand the cycle of change. You know, what we found is that if you can offer a package of support around on information, I say it's on our website, around those issues, I think it does become, I think it can, the families say they find it beneficial. You know, just sort of offering some models to help understand the relational dynamics and how to manage one's own behaviour. Also looking at this issue of enabling, because I think this may be one of the questions that may have come up before, but some families do enable their loved one to continue with the addiction rather than helping them to recover. So those are all, there's a lot of tips around looking after yourself, staying safe, how to manage this particular crisis if you're stuck at home with somebody who's got an addiction, because it's even more difficult at the moment. Does that answer the question, Joanna? It's a bit rambly, sorry.
It does, thank you. I think it's some really good tips there.
So now going back to stigma, Viv. So what strategy can we use to actually help families overcome stigma, and how can we help them find the confidence to access the support that they need?
Well, I think this needs a whole national conversation and a national campaign. In the same way that we've, I think, in this country, broken the stigma that surrounded mental ill health, we need to do the same around the stigma that surrounds substance misuse and living with someone, or having been affected by someone with substance misuse. I think often it's not just the people that you know who find it difficult to accept the situation you're in, so you don't talk about it. You feel that if you say something, you will be shunned, and this is what families tell us, this is exactly what they say, that you will be shunned, and therefore you become more isolated, therefore you're less likely, far less likely to speak out. And I know it's a bit of a cliche, but I think if lately some well-known people in our country and some politicians have spoken out about being the children of problematic drinkers, for example, and that has really begun to shift the focus and the policy focus and begin to destigmatize people in this situation. And I think it's not just sort of in the press and the media and the general public, but what we found is that a lot of professionals actually, not drug and alcohol treatment professionals, but maybe people that you come across, for example, at the GP surgery, they may have very stigmatizing attitudes towards families affected by substance misuse. You know, there's huge stigma in our country around substance misuse, and that attaches itself to family members. And I believe that it's only by enabling people to speak out that we will actually challenge that. So the more help that we can get with that, we're just designing a new national campaign to try and encourage people to speak out. And I read you Katie's story. We are receiving more and more stories, and that for me is the more we can get that out there on social media and the more we can raise awareness. I mean, it's interesting that last summer we ran a YouGov poll to try and find out how many people are affected in this way. And 1 in 10 people said that they were currently affected, but they also said that they didn't want any, so few of them want people to know about it because it can be so shaming. So national campaign and raising awareness, Livia, I think would be my easy answer. Well, it sounds like an easy answer, but I do think that is the only way we're going to do it, is we have to shift attitudes and shift perceptions, and that needs a lot of effort. But I'm sure ISSUP can help us to do that. So doing this today is great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, we've mentioned Adfam a few times so far, so I thought I'd just say that if anybody wants further information, you can go to adfam.org.uk or have a look at their Twitter feed, which is @AdfamUK. Viv, we're just going to now go to some of the questions that our audience has sent in. As you probably know, in the run-up to this interview, we asked people to send in questions, and we've had some really good responses. Lots of questions have come back in. So I just wanted to pick up on one question that came in from Sana in Pakistan, who has asked, I've encountered several spouses and children of substance users who have also become addicted, and secondly, several spouses who became codependent. What approaches can we take to address this issue?
I'm not going to be very helpful here, Sana. I think I'm not surprised at your question, but it's a really hard answer to give. I mentioned spouses and children who also become addicted, and I mentioned this issue of intergenerational transfer, and I will once again go back to my point that I don't think that there is enough help for these families, and it is quite a this codependency, and then codependency is a key issue, which requires you have to work with the couple. I think I'm not sure which approaches we can take other than the ones that I've mentioned. Maybe peer support, but probably something that's rather more interventionist, a counselling approach, if that were possible. Helping the spouses, if they are codependent, to look at their own behaviour, to look at which bits of their behaviour encourages their partner and vice versa, and actually try and break away from that and separate that out. And I think that really requires specialist intervention, therapeutic counselling. One of the pieces of work that we did last year was actually to help couples who are in conflict. There's such a lot of couple conflict because of alcohol and substance drug misuse. Couples do become codependent, and also they cause conflict between each other because of the drug taking, and that then latches onto the children. And in England, there is an approach that's been developed, I think it's developed by Tavistock Relationships, which is sorry, you'll have to email me and I'll get you the exact details. But it's a CBT approach, but it's for couples to look at the conflict that they're causing and and it's exacerbated by the substance misuse. So there are interventions out there, and it would be great if all drug and alcohol treatment services were able to offer those interventions. But like I've said before, that's often quite difficult because of finances. What I would say is, going back to I think one of the one of the key issues, I think, is to get people into treatment. into so the user can get treatment and the family member can get support around that in their own right, and also with their loved one in the case of of enabling, for example. I think treatment, I do think getting into treatment and being able to stay in treatment and being able to sustain a recovery, and that recovery I think is based on three things. It's based on having a family support, it's based on having somewhere reasonable to live, and based on having a job. So a lot of work, as you'll know, about recovery has been based around not just looking at the substance misuse, but looking at the issues around it. So I think it's a very complex question, and the answer is complex. And I guess if we had pots and pots of money so everybody could access, and there were no barriers to accessing treatment and support and these high-end interventions, then that might be the way forward. But I do think we have to treat drug and alcohol users and drug and alcohol treatment in the same way as we would any other physical problem, and it needs to be invested in, and then all being well, things might get better.
Thank you.
We have another question sort of relating to lockdown now, Viv, but this time more from the point of view of the practitioner, you know, the workforce. And this question is from Carmen in Peru, and she's asked, how can the workforce, the practitioners, support and help families in these particular lockdown circumstances?
Well, I can only talk about what I know is going on here and at Adfam. A lot of peer support groups are being held like this, held online, held with Zoom with Zoom. Excuse me. What we're doing at Adfam, our frontline workers are holding web peer support groups. They're also making sure that they phone all their families on a regular basis. We've got a lot more information on our website. I think it's particularly difficult at this time of lockdown, obviously, because you don't have that physical support. But you can, if or possibly, I hope, transfer the one-to-one work and the group work that would take place in a physical space, transfer that online, and maybe put in place a helpline, maybe put in, one of the things that we're doing is developing some videos with some self-help tips from that we will put on our website. So I think it's these practical ways of shifting from the physical environment to the web, the internet, the digital environment. I think that's the key to this. It's never going to be the same, but I think it's a very, very, very good second best. And certainly in this era of, you know, it's the way ISSUP works anyway, isn't it? In this digital era, I think it's an extremely acceptable alternative. So I hope that that's something you would be able to do, Carmen, in Peru, and look at our website. If there's anything on there that will help you, then please do.
Thanks, Viv.
Okay, so we're approaching the final 10 minutes of the interview. We've had a very good question come in from Denise, who's asked, how do we help families understand that relapse is part of the recovery process? And she followed that up by asking, how many chances should we give a family? Sorry, how many chances should family give to the substance user?
It's very, I think the point about understanding that addiction is a chronic relapsing condition is a very, very good one, and it's certainly something that we include in a lot of our information sessions for families. As far as families are concerned, how many chances? Well, there is a view that family members just totally cut themselves off from the loved one. It's called tough love. and that they have to protect themselves in the first instance. And so they might have, just give one chance and then that's it. There are other approaches that would say you have to keep on being there for that person whenever they relapse and help them out. I think it does bring, the dynamics around that are huge. I think for children, if they're living with someone who 1 minute is recovered, the next minute is relapsed, for anybody, that's very, very destabilizing. But if you were to take the view that family members need help in their own right, they need help and information. They need information about the cycle of change, information, I think, about the nature of addiction, the science of addiction, to help them understand that process of relapse and recovery. And they need support in their own right to be able to help them to make the choices around how far they continue to support that family member, how they set boundaries, how they deal with that conflict, and when, for them, the cutoff point, when the time comes when they feel for their own good, their own health, mental and physical, psychological health, that they can't go any further. And certainly, I don't think anybody would. There is nobody who would criticise them for doing that. Perfectly understandable. But I think we have to understand it's not just the family needs that help to be able to do that. You have to be very strong to be able to completely cut off from someone, and you have to be very, very strong to be able to continue to cope with the ongoing stresses of recovery and relapse. Quite right.
Okay, I think Livia, did you have the next question?
Yes, I did. And actually, Viv, my question was mostly about work participants access resources to support families. And I think you've answered that, because obviously you said they can access your website. There was one question from Alison that we've just received. She's asking, are there any resources or information for spouses of people in recovery? Are you aware of any publications on that topic?
No, not specifically, I'm not. No, I'm not, I'm afraid. I mentioned the couple conflict work, CBT work with them. No, I'm not. Of people in recovery? Yeah,
and of their in recovery.
Sorry, no, I'm nothing specific. And it probably hasn't been looked at. I'm sorry about that.
No, that's okay. Another question that just came in, Sikandar Ali has asked, how do we educate families that addiction is a disease and not a moral failing? As he's not mentioning the country he's in, but he says in his country people are not aware of that. So even the families of substance users, they don't know that. So how do we educate them?
Probably more public education, more awareness raising, as I mentioned before. I think it has to be something that's taken on in a sensible way, perhaps by the media, by local communities, by civil society. So there is more awareness of what addiction means, not just to what it is, but the impact it has on families. I think that there's a responsibility there of governments and civil society to provide that sort of information. I think it's very tricky. But it's, again, comes back to your point, your question about stigma. I think stigma gets in the way and is a barrier for any of us finding out information about this. It's a real barrier, and it needs huge, I think, public effort and awareness raising to get over that barrier. So I'm sorry I can't be any more specific on that one, because I think it's a really good. They're all really, really good questions. But some of them at the moment, I just don't think we've had the answers to without huge investment.
Thank you.
Denise has come back and has just said that a big challenge that they have in South Africa is to get families involved in treatment. They often feel it is that it is the substance user's problem and not theirs. She asked, how can we motivate families to get more involved in therapy? I think you've covered some of that, but would you have like a final takeaway message for our audience?
I think you're right, and that problem can exist in this everywhere. I think not just in South Africa, partly because of stigma, and as a barrier to accessing treatment, but also because not always treatment services will welcome a family member there. They do focus very much on the user. They don't see that the family member is affected and needs help as well. And some treatment service, I think it is getting better now, because it is recognised. If you make the argument that if you can involve a family member, somebody is far more likely to recover, get in treatment, stay there and recover. But there is still, I think in some places, this unhelpful concept that if you get the family involved, they're going to interfere. And there's also a whole myth, I believe it's a myth, around confidentiality, that you can't share information, and it's the client, the user, whose issues that have primacy. So it's a common, it can be a common problem from the treatment services point of view. And also, if family members aren't encouraged to support their loved one in treatment because of the issues at the treatment, because of the way that they're dealt with, then that's not going to help. So I think make the argument that family members are critical in helping someone get to treatment and stay there and recover afterwards, that they're absolutely key in that whole recovery, treatment and recovery journey. But my final message, but I would also say that they need help to be able to do that themselves. We need to encourage families to be welcome in treatment services, and for their contribution to that person's recovery to be recognised and celebrated as well.
Thank you, Viv.
Thanks, Viv. I think that's a really good sort of final message to give to our participants. James and Livia, is there anything that's come in that we need to add, or were you wrapping up now? Excellent. So thank you very much, Viv. We we covered a lot of subjects there, quite a range of issues, which I think just illustrates the complexity really to this issue and for this group, that there are so many individual nuances. But for the participants that have been listening, you can go back to the ISSUP website and you will see the links to Adfam, to Viv's organisation, to those resources that she has mentioned. But there are also on the ISSUP website, there is a network called Families, which is really for the people that are working with this particular group and in these settings, that you can go and have a look. But there will also be all the resources, particularly for this group, pulled together. So, anybody feel free to contact us or go there and have a look, and go onto the Adfam website to see what there is. Thank you, James and Livia, for posing the questions this afternoon with me, and thank you again to those of you that sent in your questions. It's great to have your voice through these, and thank you to you all for listening this afternoon. I wish you all well for the weekend, and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
So is it just